like each piece of information, each thought is a little bit like a drop of water onto the pond that ripples. And we're constantly being agitated by all of the ripples. And it's almost a silly thing to say, but I did have the thought/realization sometime, I think it was on the weekend, it might have been late last week, that if we don't have the thought, then there's no result that follows. So when Zen Master Bon Soeng used to say, cut off all thinking, in some ways that's what he was pointing to. Now he would always follow that cut off all thinking with meaning don't be attached to your thinking. And I think for me that makes it more accessible. None of us ask for our thoughts to come. They seem to come unbidding. Of course, as Sergey pointed out, our thoughts really aren't our own. They come from the connection to the society and the world that we live in. And we might all have our individual, maybe you could say structure of mind, but we pick up the zeitgeist and we're kind of creatures of our own culture. Even those of us who reject the culture and try to move in another way, I mean, stepping back from myself, seeing in my much younger years that strong rejection of culture, I can also see how I joined another culture. And what was mine and what was not mine is very clear. But of course, once I say that from the Zen perspective, who is this thing that has mine? I, my, me makes mind. And the I is created out of all of these situations. I've said this before, but when I was in Turkey, maybe it was the first time I was ever in a predominantly Muslim country. And I had this feeling that, well, had I grown up here, this would have been my culture, and I would have found some place in this culture to make my own, and there would have been all sorts of other thoughts and feelings that would arise different from what I have now. In some ways, you could think of our consciousness as an empty box. There's nothing really there, but it gets filled with things. And we say everything arises from conditions. So one thing leads to another. And I think I mentioned this last week, this sense that when we're very young, there's something of a mind dump that happens. There's a transfer of information from, if Sergey was using the computer model, from the older computer of the parent to the new computer of the child. And there's a wholesale transmission of thoughts, feelings, beliefs, ideas, interpretations. Parents are always explaining to children what's going on. But that explanation isn't really what's going on. It's the explanation that the parents have settled on as what's going on. So I think what Sergey was trying to point out, these aren't really ours. But right now, this is where we have to start. You hear me say this week after week after week. Practice, Zen is about being alive. It's not about being good. It's not about being bad. Yes, our precepts provide us a guidepost for ethical behavior. But it's not ethics because it's good. It's ethical because it reduces suffering. We get lost in the duality of good and bad. And Buddhism really is not about good and bad. In fact, the first lines of the third patriarch's very famous poem, Trust in Mind, says the great way is not difficult for those who don't make good and bad. Good and bad is splitting the world into dualities. The relieving of suffering breaks that down. Is it good or is it bad? That's a rational judgment. One society's good is another society's bad. That's a human judgment. But if we pay attention to our own life, we can become aware of what it is that brings suffering to self and other, and what it is that relieves suffering to self and other. And the Buddha said over and over again, my teaching is about the alleviation of suffering. It's not about becoming a better person. It's not about being able to perform better in school or on a job so you make more money or that you're more likable. Those all might be worthy endeavors if that's your path, but that's not what Zen is about. It's not what Buddhism is about. Buddhism is about the recognition of suffering and the alleviation of suffering.